In 1188, Saladin stood before the walls of Krak the Chevaliers in Syria and looked at what his army would have to fight through to take it. Saladin was the most successful military commander of the medieval world. He had defeated the armies of the Crusades in open battle. He had taken Jerusalem. He had broken fortifications across the Middle East that other generals had spent years trying to crack. He looked at Krak the Chevaliers, calculated what an assault would cost him, and turned his army around and left that he did not come back. In 1410, the combined armies of Poland and Lithuania had just destroyed the Teutonic Knights in open battle at Grunwald, one of the largest battles in medieval European history. They marched to the Knights' headquarters at Malbork Castle expecting it to fall within days. There were almost no defenders left. The siege lasted 2 months. The army went home without taking the castle. In 1424, the English army that had conquered most of France during the Hundred Years' War began a siege of Mont Saint-Michel. They brought the most powerful artillery in Europe. They blockaded the island. They waited. For 30 years. Mont Saint-Michel never fell. These are not legends. These are documented historical events. And the reason these castles survived is not simply that their walls were thick. The reason is that the engineers who built them understood something that the armies attacking them did not. A siege is not won by the side with the most soldiers. It is won by the side that can outlast the other. And these 6 castles were engineered from the ground up to outlast anything. Krak the Chevaliers sits on a volcanic outcrop in what is now western Syria, 650 meters above sea level, visible from 30 kilometers in every direction. The Crusader Knights Hospitaller took control of it in 1142 and spent the next century turning it into what historians of medieval military architecture consider the most perfectly engineered fortress ever built. The outer wall was up to 28 meters thick at its base. Not 28 meters tall. 28 meters thick. Any attempt to undermine the foundations, the standard siege technique of digging tunnels beneath walls to collapse them, was physically impossible. You would need to dig through the equivalent of a 9-story building lying on its side before reaching anything structural, but the walls were only the beginning. The inner fortification was built higher than the outer wall, which created what military engineers call enfilading fire. If an attacking army broke through the outer wall, they found themselves trapped in a narrow open corridor between the 2 walls, taking fire from above on both sides simultaneously, with no cover and no exit. The killing ground was designed with geometric precision to maximize casualties among attackers who had already expended enormous effort getting through the first line of defense. What made Krak truly unassailable was not the walls. It was the engineering inside them. The castle contained water reservoirs large enough to supply 2,000 soldiers and hundreds of horses for years without rain. The largest reservoir was so vast that it was navigated by boat during maintenance. The grain stores held enough food for 5 years of siege. The castle had its own mill to process that grain into flour and its own ovens large enough to bake bread for the entire garrison every day. This internal engineering changed the mathematics of siege warfare completely. An attacking army cannot simply surround Krak and wait. The garrison inside is more comfortable than the soldiers in tents outside. While the attacking army runs out of food, catches disease from poor sanitation in field camps, and loses soldiers to desertion when pay runs out, the garrison of Krak is eating fresh bread, drinking clean water, and sleeping in stone rooms. When Saladin arrived in 1188, he understood this calculation immediately. He was one of the greatest military minds of the medieval period and he recognized a problem that had no solution. He could storm the walls and lose thousands of men. He could besiege the castle and watch his own army disintegrate while the garrison remained comfortable inside. Neither option led to victory. He left. Krak the Chevaliers was eventually taken in 1271, not by military force, but by a forged letter. The Mamluk Sultan Baybar sent a message to the garrison claiming to be from the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, ordering them to surrender. It was a forgery. The real Grand Master had given no such order. But the garrison believed it and opened the gates. The castle that no army could break was finally opened by a piece of paper. Malbork Castle in northern Poland is the largest castle ever built. Not the tallest. The largest by total area. Its footprint covers more than 20 hectares, roughly the size of 28 football fields. It was constructed from approximately 30 million fired bricks, a quantity so vast that modern calculations suggest it would take a contemporary brick factory several years of continuous production to match it. The Teutonic Knights built Malbork as the headquarters of their military and religious order starting in 1274. They did not build a castle. They built a city in the shape of a fortress. The complex is divided into 3 separate castles, each with its own moat, drawbridge, walls, and food supplies. Breaking through the outer defenses brought an attacker face to face with a second set of defenses just as formidable. Breaking through those brought a third. The engineering detail that distinguishes Malbork from every other castle in medieval Europe is its heating system. The castle contained a central heating infrastructure that used furnaces in the basement levels to heat air, which then traveled through channels built into the floors and walls to warm the living quarters above. This was not a primitive system. It was a sophisticated thermal engineering solution that kept the interior of the castle at a livable temperature throughout the harsh Polish winters while the attacking army outside froze in their tents. This matters militarily in a way that is easy to underestimate. A garrison that is warm, dry, and comfortable maintains its fighting capability and its morale through months of siege. An attacking army camped in winter conditions suffers constant casualties from cold, from disease, from the physical and psychological deterioration that comes from living in field conditions for extended periods. The engineers of Malbork understood that comfort inside the walls was a weapon. After the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where the Teutonic Knights suffered catastrophic defeat, the fortress's commander Heinrich von Plauen had only a handful of defenders and was facing the largest army in Central Europe. He burned the wooden buildings around the walls to create clear fields of fire, organized his skeleton garrison to maximum effect, and relied on the castle's engineering to do the rest. The Polish and Lithuanian army besieged Malbork for 2 months. Their artillery fired continuously. One cannonball from that siege is still embedded in the wall of the summer refectory where it struck and failed to penetrate. The garrison stayed warm behind their brick walls. The attacking army, already stretched after the enormous effort of Grunwald, began to fracture. The Lithuanian forces left to go home. The mercenaries demanded payment that was not available. The greatest army in Central European history withdrew from a castle defended by a fraction of normal garrison strength. The heating system did not win the siege alone. But it was part of an engineering philosophy that made the defenders' situation more sustainable than the attackers. In siege warfare, sustainable wins. In 1283, the English King Edward I commissioned the construction of Conwy Castle on a narrow rocky promontory on the north coast of Wales. Edward was conducting a systematic military and architectural campaign to permanently control Wales, and his approach was an engineering innovation that changed medieval castle design permanently. He built the castle and the town walls simultaneously as a single integrated defensive system. Conwy Castle has 8 massive circular towers connected by curtain walls that follow the natural contours of the rock outcrop. Each tower was designed to function as an independent fortification if the walls between them were breached. An attacking force that broke through the outer defenses would not find themselves inside the castle. They would find themselves in a space covered by fire from multiple towers simultaneously, with no shelter and no clear path forward. The engineering innovation that made Conwy genuinely different from previous castle designs was the water gate. A dedicated entrance built into the castle walls at sea level allowed supply ships to dock directly at the castle and unload provisions, reinforcements, and equipment without any contact with the surrounding land. This single feature invalidated the fundamental strategy of medieval siege warfare, which was to cut off a fortification from all outside supply and wait for starvation to force surrender. You cannot starve a castle that has direct access to the sea. Any attacking force that lacked a navy capable of blockading the coastline could not conduct a meaningful siege of Conwy at all. In 1294, the castle's design was tested in a way its builders had not anticipated. King Edward I himself was inside Conwy when a Welsh uprising cut the castle off from the mainland during a severe storm. The river flooded. The relief army could not reach the castle. Food supplies ran critically low. The garrison was reduced to rationing bread and water. Edward refused to surrender. The walls held. When the flooding receded, the English fleet arrived by sea through the water gate. The siege collapsed without a single breach in the castle's structure. The walls of Conwy were originally plastered white with lime, so that on clear days the castle was visible as a blinding white structure for miles across the bay. This was not decoration. It was psychological engineering. The visibility of the castle communicated English military power to the surrounding population continuously and permanently. The sight of those white walls was engineered to communicate the futility of resistance to anyone considering it. Part 4, Stirling, the castle that absorbed artillery. 1230, 16:30 Stirling Castle in Scotland sits on top of a volcanic plug, a column of solidified magma left standing after the softer rock around it eroded away over millions of years. The cliff faces on three sides of the rock drop between 30 and 80 meters vertically. There is one approach to the castle gate. 1. Through a narrow ridge with sheer drops on both sides, where an attacking force is funneled into a killing corridor that the defenders have been fortifying and perfecting for centuries. The phrase used in medieval Scotland was that whoever held Stirling held Scotland. It was not metaphor. The castle sits at the geographical bottleneck between the lowlands of central Scotland and the Highland territories to the north. There was no practical route around it. Every army that wanted to move between the two halves of Scotland had to pass within range of Stirling's walls. In 1304, Edward I of England conducted what became one of the most technically sophisticated siege operations of the medieval period against Stirling. The Scottish garrison inside numbered approximately 30 soldiers. Edward brought every siege engine available to the English crown, culminating in the construction of a trebuchet called the Warwolf, the largest siege engine ever recorded in medieval history, capable of throwing projectiles weighing 150 kilograms. The Scottish garrison watched the Warwolf being assembled from the walls and sent out an offer of surrender. Edward refused to accept it. He had spent months building the Warwolf and he was going to use it. The garrison withdrew their offer and kept fighting. The Warwolf bombarded the castle. The walls took direct hits from 150-kilogram projectiles and held. The volcanic rock on which Stirling is built absorbed the impact energy that would have shattered conventional foundation materials. The castle's builders had not engineered this, but they had chosen the site because of it, and the choice proved decisive against the most powerful siege weapon of the AGE.I in the 15th century, when gunpowder artillery made the high stone towers of traditional castles increasingly vulnerable. Stirling's engineers developed an adaptation that modern military historians regard as one of the first successful responses to artillery warfare in Europe. They constructed earthwork bastions against the outer walls, thick banks of compacted earth that absorbed cannon fire rather than fracturing under it. Stone shatters when a cannonball hits it. Earth absorbs the impact and stays in place. The modification transformed a medieval castle into a functional fortification in the age of gunpowder. Edinburgh Castle has been besieged 26 times in recorded history. No other fortification in the world has a documented record of successful defense against that many assault attempts. The castle sits on a volcanic plug like Stirling, with sheer vertical cliffs on three sides dropping 80 meters to the city below. The single approach is up a narrow ridge that defenders have been killing people on for 3,000 years. The castle's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. On top of a granite rock with no natural water source, the garrison depended entirely on wells drilled through solid rock. The main well went 30 meters straight down through hard igneous stone. In dry years or severe winters it failed. When it failed, the garrison could collect rainwater from the castle surfaces, but in prolonged dry sieges this was not sufficient. During the long siege of 1571 to 1573, supporters of Mary Queen of Scots held Edinburgh Castle against the combined forces of the Scottish Protestant government and the English army for 2 years. English artillery was positioned on surrounding hills and fired continuously for weeks. One of the main towers collapsed entirely. The debris blocked the primary well. The garrison survived by licking condensation from the stone walls. By collecting rainwater on pieces of cloth stretched across the courtyards. By rationing every drop of water with a precision that the castle's commander enforced at risk of execution for waste. They held for 2 years before finally surrendering. Not because the walls had failed. Because the water had run out, the castle changed hands so many times in its history, partly because of this water vulnerability, but more because its position at the center of Scotland's capital made it the symbolic prize of every conflict. Every army that took Scotland wanted the flag over Edinburgh Castle. Every army that lost Scotland needed to take it back. The same rock that made it nearly impregnable made it permanently contested. Mont Saint-Michel rises from a granite outcrop in the bay of the same name on the Normandy coast of France. At high tide it is an island. At low tide it sits surrounded by a vast expanse of tidal flats. The tides in the Bay of Mont Saint-Michel are among the fastest and most extreme in Europe. The water rises and falls by up to 14 meters. The incoming tide moves across the flat sand at speeds that a running person can barely outpace. During the 100 Years' War, England conquered virtually all of northern France. City after city fell to English armies equipped with the longbow and increasingly powerful artillery. Mont Saint-Michel never fell. For 30 years the English maintained a continuous effort to take it. They failed completely. The engineering of Mont Saint-Michel's defense was not primarily architectural. It was geographic. The garrison had studied the tidal patterns of the bay with a precision that amounted to a scientific understanding of the tidal cycle. They knew exactly when the flats were safe to cross, when they were dangerous, and when the incoming tide would overtake anyone caught on them. In 1434, the English launched their largest assault. They brought enormous bombards, the most powerful artillery in existence, capable of throwing projectiles weighing several hundred kilograms. The outer defenses began to crumble. English soldiers broke into the lower levels of the town at the base of the rock. The garrison fell back to higher ground and waited. The incoming tide came. The English soldiers who had broken through the outer defenses were now in the narrow streets of the lower town, unfamiliar with the ground, unable to move quickly in armor, with no knowledge of where the water would rise to and how fast. The garrison knew every centimeter of the ground and had prepared positions at every level. The tide cut off the English forces' retreat. The assault collapsed. The English abandoned two enormous artillery pieces on the sand as they fled, leaving them to be swallowed by the returning water. Those two cannons were recovered by the garrison. They stand at the entrance to Mont Saint-Michel today. They have stood there for 6 centuries as monuments to the only defense that has never been improved upon by any engineer, knowing your ground better than your enemy does. 6 castles. None of them taken by direct military assault while their engineering was intact and their garrisons were supplied. What they share is not simply thick walls or high towers. What they share is a philosophy of engineering that understood war as an endurance problem rather than a strength problem. The garrison that can eat, drink clean water, stay warm, and maintain its morale will outlast any army camped in a field regardless of how many soldiers that army contains. Saladin understood this when he looked at Krak the Chevaliers and turned away. The Polish army understood this when they went home from Malbork. The English understood this when their soldiers drowned in the tidal flats of Mont Saint-Michel. The greatest military engineers of the medieval world were not building walls. They were building systems. Water systems. Food systems. Heating systems. Psychological systems designed to communicate invincibility before the first arrow was fired. The walls kept the enemy out. The engineering inside kept the defenders alive long enough for the enemy to give up. Subscribe. Because the people who built these castles understood something about engineering and endurance that the modern world spent centuries forgetting and is only now beginning to rediscover.